March 20th, 1943 dawned cold and gray over the English countryside when Captain Robert Johnson climbed into the cramped cockpit of his Republic P47 Thunderbolt for the first time in combat conditions. The massive fighter aircraft sat on the tarmac like a dormant predator, its enormous radial engine promising both salvation and destruction. Johnson had heard the rumors circulating among bomber crews about losses mounting over occupied Europe, about Messerschmitt fighters tearing through formations like wolves through sheep. Today, everything would change? The P-47 Thunderbolt represented America's answer to a desperate problem. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, United States Army Air Force's bombers flying deep penetration raids into Nazi-held territory suffered catastrophic casualties. Without adequate fighter escort capable of matching German interceptors in both range and combat capability, bomber losses sometimes exceeded 10% per mission. Crews whispered that completing a 25-mission tour had become a statistical impossibility. The men needed protection, and the Thunderbolt arrived as their unlikely guardian angel. Weighing nearly 7 tons when fully loaded, the P-47 stood as the heaviest single-engine fighter of its time. Its distinctive Razorback fuselage housed a Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine generating 2,000 horsepower, driving a massive 13-foot propeller. 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns bristled from its wings, capable of delivering over 100 rounds per second of devastating firepower. Yet despite these impressive specifications, many pilots initially viewed the aircraft with skepticism. British Royal Air Force pilots mockingly called it the 7-ton milk jug due to its bulbous appearance and ponderous handling at low speeds. Major General William Kepner, commander of 8 Fighter Command, understood that perception and reality often diverged in warfare. He recognized that the Thunderbolt possessed capabilities that transcended its ungainly appearance. The aircraft could climb to altitudes where German fighters struggled to operate effectively. Its turbocharged engine maintained power at heights exceeding 30,000 feet, allowing American pilots to hold the vertical advantage against Luftwaffe interceptors. More importantly, the P-47 could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter fighters. Its air-cooled radial engine continued functioning even after sustaining multiple cannon strikes, and pilots discovered they could survive encounters that would prove fatal in other aircraft. German fighter pilot Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s over France during this period, first encountered Thunderbolts during an escort mission to Rouen, according to combat reports filed with Jagdgeschwader. 27. Stigler initially dismissed the large American fighters as easy targets. That assessment changed within minutes. The Thunderbolts refused to engage in the turning dogfights where German fighters excelled, instead utilizing diving attacks and energy tactics that exploited their superior weight and power. When Stigler attempted to pursue a damaged P-47, the American pilot simply pointed his nose downward and accelerated beyond 400 miles per hour, a speed at which the Bf-109's controls became dangerously stiff. The German watched helplessly as his quarry escaped toward England. This tactical revelation spread quickly through Luftwaffe units. Intelligence officers began documenting a disturbing pattern as documented in captured German military records now held at the National Archives in Washington. The Americans had deployed a fighter that fundamentally altered the dynamics of aerial combat over Western Europe. Traditional dogfighting techniques proved increasingly ineffective against pilots who understood and exploited the Thunderbolt's unique characteristics. German commanders realized they faced not merely a new aircraft, but an entirely different combat philosophy that threatened their operational effectiveness. By late spring of 1943, Luftwaffe airfields across occupied France buzzed with anxious discussions about the growing American fighter presence. Ground attack missions, once considered relatively safe assignments for experienced pilots, transformed into hazardous operations as Thunderbolts began carrying bombs and rockets. The psychological impact extended beyond aviators to Wehrmacht ground forces, who learned to dread the distinctive sound of approaching Pratt & Whitney engines. June 17, 1943 marked a turning point in the air war when Colonel Hubert Zemck led the 56th Fighter Group on a bomber escort mission to Bremen. Zemke had spent weeks developing tactics specifically designed to maximize the Thunderbolt's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. His pilots no longer attempted to turn with German fighters at medium altitudes. Instead, they maintained formation discipline, used altitude advantage to initiate attacks, and employed the aircraft's exceptional dive performance to disengage when necessary. The mission resulted in 11 confirmed German aircraft destroyed without losing a single P-47, a ratio that shocked both American and German high commands. Zemke's tactical innovations spread rapidly through the 8th Air Force Fighter Group stationed in England. Pilots learned to think of the Thunderbolt not as a traditional fighter, but as an energy fighter that dominated through superior speed, dive performance, and firepower concentration. Captain Robert Johnson, who would eventually become one of the war's leading American aces, described the doctrine transformation in his post-war memoir. Johnson explained that pilots stopped trying to outmaneuver German fighters and instead focused on destroying them through coordinated high-speed attacks that exploited the P-47's devastating armament. 8 50-caliber machine guns firing in synchronized bursts could literally disintegrate enemy aircraft when properly aimed. German pilots adapted their tactics in response to this American approach. Luftwaffe training schools began emphasizing vertical maneuvers and energy management techniques designed to counter the Thunderbolt's advantages. Experienced German aces like Major Egon Meyer developed specific tactics for engaging P-47 formations, including head-on attacks that denied American pilots the opportunity to leverage their superior diving speed. These techniques proved effective against inexperienced American pilots but offered decreasing returns as the quality of 8th Air Force fighter crews steadily improved throughout 1943. The technological arms race intensified as both sides sought advantages. Republic Aviation continuously improved the Thunderbolt design, introducing variants with increased range through external fuel tanks, bubble canopies for improved visibility, and uprated engines delivering even greater performance. The P-47D model, entering service in late 1943, addressed many of the early complaints about cockpit visibility and climb rate. Meanwhile, German engineers rushed to deploy improved versions of the Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf F-W-190, incorporating more powerful engines and heavier armament capable of penetrating the P-47's rugged construction. Oberleutnant Walter Krupinski, a highly decorated Luftwaffe pilot with over 190 victories, provided insight into German pilot psychology during this period in post-war interviews conducted by American historians. Krupinski acknowledged that encountering Thunderbolts fundamentally changed how German fighter pilots approached combat missions. The Americans possessed sufficient numbers, adequate training, and increasingly sophisticated tactics that transformed the strategic situation. German pilots could no longer assume technical or tactical superiority, forcing them to adopt more cautious operational approaches that reduced their overall effectiveness. The psychological dimension of aerial combat assumed greater importance as the war progressed. German pilots reported feeling increasingly pressured by the relentless presence of American fighters escorting bomber streams deep into Reich territory. The Thunderbolt's distinctive appearance made it immediately recognizable, and its reputation for survivability meant that German pilots understood they needed to achieve killing hits rather than merely damaging these robust aircraft. This requirement increased the risk German pilots faced during engagement, as getting close enough to guarantee destructive hits exposed them to the P-47's formidable defensive firepower. Ground-based Wehrmacht units began reporting encounters with Thunderbolts conducting strafing attacks against transportation networks, supply columns, and tactical targets throughout occupied Europe. Unlike bombers that attacked from altitude, the P-47S roared over at treetop level, their 8 machine guns shredding anything caught in the open. German soldiers learned to recognize the sound of approaching radial engines and developed elaborate camouflage and dispersal techniques to minimize casualties. According to captured German military correspondents analyzed in the book To Command the Sky by military historian Stephen McFarland, references to American fighter bombers appeared with increasing frequency in tactical reports throughout the latter half of 1943. Colonel Zenk's ongoing tactical refinements created a fighter doctrine that would influence American air combat theory for decades. His emphasis on mutual support, energy management, and exploiting aircraft-specific advantages rather than attempting to match enemy strengths in areas where American fighters proved inferior established principles that remained relevant into the jet age. October 14, 1943 became known among American bomber crews as Black Thursday, when the 8th Air Force launched a massive raid against ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, Germany. Despite Thunderbolt escorts providing protection during the initial stages of the mission, the P-47's limited range forced them to turn back before bombers reached their target. Without fighter protection, German interceptors savaged the bomber formations, destroying 60 B-17s and damaging another 17 beyond repair. The catastrophic losses demonstrated that even the mighty Thunderbolt could not solve all problems when operational radius constrained its effectiveness. The Schweinfurt disaster galvanized American efforts to extend the P-47's combat radius. Engineers at Republic Aviation worked frantically to develop external fuel tank systems that would allow Thunderbolts to accompany bombers deeper into German territory. The solution involved streamlined drop tanks carried beneath the wings and fuselage, containing additional fuel that pilots could jettison when entering combat. Initial designs proved problematic, with tanks sometimes failing to release properly or creating excessive drag that compromised performance. However, by early 1944, reliable drop tank systems extended the P-47's effective combat radius to approximately 450 miles, allowing escorts to reach targets deep inside Germany. German defensive planners responded to the increased American fighter presence by reorganizing their interceptor forces and reinforcing fighter units stationed in the Reich. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, issued increasingly desperate orders demanding that his pilots stop the American bomber offensive regardless of cost. German fighter pilots found themselves caught between impossible demands from leadership and the harsh realities of combat against numerically superior American forces equipped with capable aircraft and improving tactics. The psychological strain manifested in rising casualty rates among experienced German aviators whose skills and knowledge proved irreplaceable as the war continued. Captain Francis Gabreski emerged as one of the P-47's most successful practitioners during this period, eventually achieving 28 confirmed aerial victories before being shot down over occupied France in July 1944. Gabreski's success stemmed from his thorough understanding of the Thunderbolt's capabilities and limitations combined with exceptional situational awareness that allowed him to position himself advantageously before initiating attacks. His combat reports, preserved in Air Force historical archives, reveal a methodical approach to aerial combat that emphasized patience, tactical positioning, and overwhelming firepower concentration when opportunities presented themselves. The Thunderbolt's legendary durability became evident through countless survival stories that circulated among American fighter groups. Lieutenant Robert Johnson survived an encounter with German ace Oberleutnant Egon Meyer on June 26, 1943, despite his aircraft sustaining catastrophic damage from cannon fire. Johnson's P-47 absorbed over 200 hits, losing portions of its tail section and suffering engine damage that would have destroyed most other fighters. Yet the rugged Thunderbolt continued flying, carrying Johnson back to England where he executed a successful emergency landing. The incident, witnessed by multiple pilots on both sides, reinforced the aircraft's reputation for exceptional survivability. German intelligence officers compiled extensive reports analyzing the Thunderbolt's characteristics and developing countermeasures. These documents, captured after the war and now available to researchers, reveal the respect and concern German military professionals held for the American fighter. One report dated December 1943 noted that the P-47 represented the most significant threat to German defensive operations over the Reich, not merely because of its performance characteristics, but due to the growing numbers of these aircraft entering service. The report recommended that German fighter pilots avoid prolonged engagements with Thunderbolt formations and instead focus on attacking bombers before escorts arrived or after they departed. The strategic implications of American fighter superiority became increasingly apparent as 1943 drew to a close. German aircraft production struggled to replace losses while simultaneously expanding output to meet growing defensive requirements. Meanwhile, American industrial capacity generated fighters at rates German planners found incomprehensible. Republic Aviation's factories produced over 15,000 Thunderbolts throughout the war, with production peaking at over 600 aircraft monthly during 1944. This quantitative advantage, combined with improving pilot quality, created an unsustainable situation for the Luftwaffe. Wehrmacht ground forces in occupied territories began experiencing the full weight of Allied air superiority as Thunderbolts increasingly focused on ground attack missions. The P-47's ability to carry bombs and rockets while maintaining defensive capabilities made it ideal for attacking transportation networks, supply dumps, and tactical targets. German soldiers described feeling helpless against aircraft that appeared overhead without warning, delivered devastating attacks, and departed before effective anti-aircraft response could develop. The psychological impact of constant air attack degraded German combat effectiveness even in sectors where Allied ground forces had not yet arrived. June 6, 1944 arrived with the massive Allied invasion of Normandy, and Thunderbolt squadrons played crucial roles in establishing air superiority over the invasion beaches. Pilots flew multiple sorties daily, attacking German strong points, strafing transportation routes, and engaging any Luftwaffe aircraft attempting to interfere with the landing operations. The 9th Air Force, equipped primarily with P-47s, flew over 12,000 sorties during the first week of the invasion, creating a protective umbrella that allowed ground forces to establish and expand their beachhead with minimal interference from German aviation. German forces defending Normandy quickly learned to fear the distinctive silhouette of approaching Thunderbolts. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the elite Panzer Lehr Division, recorded in his diary that movement during daylight hours became nearly impossible due to constant Allied fighter-bomber attacks. His division, considered one of Germany's finest armored units, suffered devastating losses during its movement toward the invasion front. Thunderbolts equipped with 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets proved particularly effective against German armor, with each P-47 capable of carrying 10 rockets in addition to bombs and its standard machine gun armament. The tactical air support system developed by Allied forces during the Normandy campaign revolutionized ground-air cooperation. Forward air controllers embedded with ground units communicated directly with circling P-47 formations, directing attacks against German positions within minutes of identification. This rapid response capability allowed Allied ground commanders to employ air power as flexible artillery, suppressing enemy positions and destroying strong points that threatened offensive operations. German defenders found themselves unable to establish cohesive defensive lines when any concentration of forces immediately attracted devastating air attacks. Lieutenant Colonel Elwin Rigetti, commanding the 55th Fighter Group's 338th Fighter Squadron, exemplified the aggressive spirit that characterized Thunderbolt operations in France. Rigetti led his pilots on low-level attacks against German transportation networks, destroying locomotives, supply trucks, and fuel depots throughout occupied France. His squadron developed specialized tactics for attacking heavily defended targets, using terrain masking to approach unseen and coordinating simultaneous attacks from multiple directions to overwhelm German anti-aircraft defenses. These techniques proved so effective that German military commanders complained they could no longer safely move supplies even at night. The Luftwaffe attempted to contest Allied air superiority over France, but found itself overwhelmed by numerical disadvantage and increasingly sophisticated American tactics. German fighter units stationed in France suffered catastrophic losses during June and July 1944, with some squadrons losing their entire complement of aircraft multiple times. Young German pilots with minimal training faced American aviators who had accumulated hundreds of combat hours and developed tactics refined through years of aerial warfare. The qualitative disparity combined with quantitative disadvantage created an impossible situation for Luftwaffe commanders attempting to defend French airspace. Major Georg Peter Eder, one of Germany's leading fighter aces with over 70 confirmed victories, described the period following the Normandy invasion as the most challenging of his combat career in post-war interviews. Eder explained that German pilots faced not merely superior numbers but an entire system of air warfare that the Allies had perfected through years of combat experience. American fighters operated within a comprehensive network including radar early warning, ground-based controllers, efficient logistics, and robust maintenance support that allowed sustained high-tempo operations. German forces could achieve occasional tactical successes, but could not match the systematic application of air power that characterized Allied operations. The destruction of German transportation networks in France represented one of the P-47's most significant contributions to Allied victory in Normandy. Thunderbolt squadrons systematically attacked rail lines, bridges, marshalling yards, and road networks, creating massive disruptions in German logistics. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces defending France, reported to Berlin that Allied air attacks had reduced his combat effectiveness by more than 50%. German units reached the front under strength, undersupplied, and exhausted from constant harassment during movement. This logistical paralysis prevented German commanders from concentrating sufficient forces to mount effective counterattacks against Allied lodgements. As Allied forces broke out from Normandy in late July 1944, Thunderbolt squadrons ranged across France attacking retreating German columns. The Falaise Pocket, where Allied forces encircled substantial German formations, became a killing ground where P-47s attacked trapped enemy units mercilessly. German soldiers who survived described apocalyptic scenes of destruction, with burning vehicles blocking roads and making organized withdrawal impossible. The psychological trauma inflicted by these attacks affected German combat effectiveness for the remainder of the war, as soldiers became reluctant to concentrate forces or move during daylight hours. September 1944 found Thunderbolt units operating from bases in liberated France and Belgium, bringing the air war directly to German soil. The 8th Air Force continued its strategic bombing campaign against German industrial targets, while the 9th Air Force focused on tactical support for advancing ground forces. P-47 pilots flew missions ranging from high-altitude bomber escort to low-level ground attack, demonstrating the aircraft's remarkable versatility. German defenders now fought with their backs against their homeland, making the aerial combat increasingly desperate and violent. The introduction of German jet aircraft represented the Luftwaffe's attempt to regain technical superiority in aerial combat. The Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter possessed performance characteristics that exceeded any Allied piston-engine aircraft, including the Thunderbolt. However, German jet deployment occurred too late and in sufficient numbers to affect the war's outcome. American pilots developed tactics for countering jets, including attacking them during vulnerable takeoff and landing phases when their speed advantage proved meaningless. Major George Preddy, leading Thunderbolt ace with over 26 confirmed victories, successfully engaged Me 262s using tactics that exploited the jet's poor acceleration at low speeds and limited endurance. German industrial capacity struggled to maintain aircraft production despite heroic efforts by Minister of Armaments Albert Speer. Allied bombing systematically destroyed factories, disrupted supply chains, and killed skilled workers essential for manufacturing complex military equipment. Captured German production records reveal that aircraft output peaked in September 1944, but quality declined precipitously as manufacturers substituted inferior materials and employed increasingly inexperienced workers. Many German fighters reached operational units with defects that compromised performance or reliability, further degrading Luftwaffe combat effectiveness. The fuel crisis afflicting Germany during late 1944 proved even more debilitating than aircraft shortages. Allied attacks against synthetic fuel plants reduced German aviation fuel production to critical levels, forcing the Luftwaffe to curtail training programs and limit operational sorties. German pilots received minimal flight training before assignment to combat units, sometimes accumulating fewer than 100 total flight hours. These poorly trained aviators stood little chance against American pilots, who had logged hundreds of combat hours and benefited from comprehensive training programs that emphasized both technical skills and tactical employment. Oberstleutnant Johann Steinhoff, commanding Jagdgeschwader 77, described the desperation German fighter pilots felt during this period in his post-war memoir, The Straits of Messina. Steinhoff explained that German pilots understood they fought a losing battle but continued flying out of duty, patriotism, and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. He noted that encountering Thunderbolt formations filled even experienced German aviators with dread, knowing the Americans possessed numerical superiority, adequate fuel, competent leadership, and aircraft maintained to high standards. German pilots flew obsolescent fighters with unreliable engines, minimal ammunition, and uncertain prospects of surviving their next mission. The winter offensive launched by Germany in December 1944, known as the Battle of the Bulge, represented the Wehrmacht's final major offensive operation in the West. Poor weather initially grounded Allied aircraft, allowing German forces to achieve tactical surprise and significant penetrations. However, when weather cleared on December 23, Thunderbolt squadrons unleashed devastating attacks against German columns advancing through the Ardennes forests. The concentrated application of Allied air power contributed significantly to halting the German offensive and ultimately destroying much of the committed German armor and veteran formations. During the Bulge fighting, Thunderbolt pilot Captain William Overstreet achieved legendary status by pursuing a German Bf 109 through the arches of the Eiffel Tower during low-level combat over Paris. While this specific incident remains debated by historians, it exemplifies the aggressive spirit and exceptional flying skills that characterized American fighter pilots during the war's final months. American aviators had evolved from inexperienced rookies in 1943 to confident professionals capable of dominating German airspace and dictating terms of aerial engagement. The strategic bombing campaign reached its crescendo during early 1945 as Allied air forces systematically destroyed remaining German industry and transportation networks. Thunderbolt units participated in massive coordinated attacks involving thousands of aircraft, overwhelming German defenses through sheer numbers and sophisticated tactics. German anti-aircraft defenses, once formidable, degraded due to ammunition shortages, personnel losses, and difficulties maintaining complex fire control equipment. The Wehrmacht found itself unable to defend German airspace, industrial facilities, or military installations against Allied air attack. January 1945 brought the coldest winter in decades across Europe, yet aerial combat continued unabated. Thunderbolt squadrons flew missions in conditions that would have grounded aviation operations during peacetime, demonstrating the aircraft's reliability and the dedication of ground crews who maintained these fighters under harsh circumstances. German forces launched Operation Bodenplatte on January 1st, a desperate attempt to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground through coordinated surprise attacks against forward airfields. The operation achieved some tactical success but cost the Luftwaffe irreplaceable pilots and aircraft, further weakening German defensive capabilities. The Rhine River crossings in March 1945 showcased the evolution of tactical air support to unprecedented levels of sophistication. Thunderbolt squadrons provided continuous coverage over Allied ground forces, attacking German defensive positions, interdicting reinforcements, and preventing organized counterattacks. The 9th Air Force developed procedures allowing fighter bombers to respond to requests for support within minutes, creating a responsive system that integrated air and ground operations seamlessly. German defenders found themselves unable to maneuver or concentrate forces without immediately attracting overwhelming air attack. Major Robert Baseler, leading elements of the 325th Fighter Group through the final months of combat, witnessed the systematic destruction of remaining German military capability. His combat reports describe missions where P-47s encountered minimal German air opposition but faced heavy anti-aircraft fire from ground positions. German flak crews fought tenaciously despite knowing the war approached its end, inflicting casualties on Allied aircraft through sheer determination and skillful gunnery. However, the absence of German fighter coverage meant that Allied aircraft could methodically suppress flak positions, before conducting actual attack runs against primary targets. The discovery of concentration camps by advancing Allied forces added moral urgency to the air campaign's final stages. Pilots who witnessed the horrors perpetrated by the Nazi regime understood their missions, contributed to ending one of history's greatest evils. This knowledge sustained morale during the war's final brutal months when combat fatigue affected even veteran units. Thunderbolt squadrons continued flying multiple daily sorties, grinding down remaining German military forces and hastening the Third Reich's collapse. German cities became battlegrounds as Allied forces advanced from both east and west. Thunderbolt units attacked transportation networks within urban areas, destroying rail facilities and road bridges essential for moving military supplies. The sight of American fighters operating freely over German cities symbolized the complete collapse of German air defenses and the Wehrmacht's inability to protect its homeland. German civilians, who had endured years of Allied bombing, now witnessed the final act of their nation's defeat played out in the skies above their cities. Hauptmann Heinz Nock, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot who survived the war, recorded in his diary that flying combat missions during March and April 1945 felt surreal. German pilots knew the war was lost yet continued fighting from duty and inability to imagine alternative courses of action. Nock described encountering overwhelming numbers of Allied fighters during nearly every mission, forcing German pilots to adopt purely defensive tactics focused on survival rather than achieving military objectives. The psychological burden of fighting a hopeless battle while watching his nation collapse devastated morale among surviving German aviators. As April 1945 progressed, Thunderbolt missions increasingly involved supporting ground forces racing across Germany toward meeting points with Soviet forces advancing from the east. The rapid pace of Allied advances created logistical challenges for air units attempting to maintain close support while operating from increasingly distant airfields. However, the excellent range and reliability of the P-47 allowed squadrons to remain effective even when operating from bases hundreds of miles from the front lines. This operational flexibility proved invaluable during the war's chaotic final weeks. The encounter between American and Soviet forces along the Elbe River in late April 1945 marked the effective end of organized German resistance in Central Europe. Thunderbolt squadrons flew reconnaissance missions coordinating positions between advancing Allied forces while continuing to attack isolated German units that refused surrender. The unusual sight of American and Soviet aircraft operating in the same airspace symbolized the multinational effort required to defeat Nazi Germany and the complete Allied air superiority achieved after years of costly combat. May 8, 1945 brought victory in Europe Day and the official end of combat operations. Thunderbolt squadrons throughout Europe stood down from combat operations, their mission accomplished after 3 years of sustained aerial warfare. The aircraft that German troops had learned to fear sat silent on airfields across liberated Europe, their weapons finally stilled. Yet the psychological impact of the P-47 Thunderbolt on German military forces would endure in memories and historical accounts for generations to come. The immediate post-war period brought reflection on the P-47 Thunderbolt's contribution to Allied victory. Statistical analysis revealed that Thunderbolt pilots had achieved over 3,700 aerial victories during the war, more than any other American fighter type in the European theater. Beyond these numbers lay the